Hey, how's it going? It's Damon Knight, Damon as the man, lineal descendant of the band of Mdewakanton Sioux. Gonna be talking about the difference between an IRA Indian, friendly Sioux Indian, and a loyal Sioux Indian. Now, the terms I may use are not our ancestors' code. So Sioux, when I say Sioux, this is what we are described and listed as on census rolls. But anyway, to get into the video, 1805 to 1858, there were treaty signings signed by chiefs of bands and villages of Dakota nations. When treaties were signed, these were agreements on land areas for money to be put in an account for lineal descendants for the reward of treaty signings. Chiefs back then lived like ambassadors. When they went to Washington, D.C., they got nothing but the highest respect. They lived in large cabin homes. Chief Teote Duta, Dakota's elders say, he had a two-story log cabin house, living better than the Indians today. They made agreements. They got awards instantly in goods while signing the treaties. The War of 1862 broke out because the Dakota people were placed on two reservations on each side of the Minnesota River, 10 miles, on the Lower Sioux Agency and the Upper Sioux Agency. The Mdewakanton Wapakude were placed on the Lower Sioux Agency. The Sisseton and Wahpeton were placed on the Upper Sioux Agency. These were after the treaty signings of 1858. These Indians were moved onto those lands. Now, before 1858, that is when Minnesota became an established territory of the United States as a state, Minnesota. But before that, from 1851 to 1856, the half-blood and mixed-blood Lake Pepin relinquishment of land and land patents given unto half-breed Minnesota Sioux. There was about, I believe, 650 people on the census roll of the Jones and Johnson's report in 1855 and 1856. These people got up to 40 to 640 acres of land. Titles of land, absolute title, ownership, full mineral rights, full sovereignty to these lands in the public domain, trading their reservation allotment for land in the public domain. Businessmen wanted these lands where the reservation for the 12 miles are placed today. These towns, New Ulm, going all the way up through that Brown County. This was land that business and settlers wanted more than the Indians. But the Indians were starving. They were relying on the government to give them food and annuity payments, and they were late on doing so. And even stories go, when they did get barrels of pork, the pork smelt so bad that Dakotas had to bury the bins without even opening them. Blankets were covered with smallpox. We know the stories. So Teote Duta, Cut Nose, also known as Standing Buffalo, Chief Shakpe, Minnetonka, I believe Red Wing. He might not have been Red Wing, but these few warriors stuck out to New Ulm for the first attack that established the 1862 Dakota Uprising War. Now, this was a bad time for Minnesota to be attacked by the Dakota Indians for the fact that the Civil War was going on and people of the military in Minnesota were fighting in the South. So citizens of New Ulm came together in the middle of their town to be able to fight off the Dakota Indians. And Dakota Indians were burning down buildings, arson, using buildings for military posts for the temporary use. New Ulm citizens did give a great fight back. I mean, even burning down their hideouts. This war went on for months. And when Henry Sibley figured out that the war broke out, he was gathering people of townships and settlements to be able to fight into the war against the Indians. But when this happened, like I said, the Lake Pepin, lands were being issued. This was before the Dakota War. This was land given after the 1837 treaty, where chiefs' descendants were given $100,000 land, and my grandmother Angeline, in 1 year before the Dakota Uprising War, she got a land certificate, 160 acres in Wheatland allotments in Minnesota, 5 minutes from the spot that I sit onto right now. From New Ulm to St. Paul, she told settlers and white folks, saying, the Dakota Indians are fighting. Save yourselves, save your families, hide to New Ulm for protection, or hide to St. Paul or St. Peter for protection. They're coming, they're angry. So as we look into history, mostly women that were married to French Canadian men were considered loyal Mdewakanton, because they would tell their husbands would tell Henry Sibley and the military that was there, so forth. So the war broke out. So now this is where I start defining what a loyal Mdewakanton is. Now, if your family, and this was, the list of loyal Mdewakantons as the individual, the list doesn't even reach to 100. Okay, it wasn't a lot of people. You stayed in Minnesota, and you didn't participate in the war, and you saved white settlers. This is what defined you as a loyal Mdewakanton. But after the Dakota hanging of 38 plus 2, in 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed underneath his hand the executive order for the Dakota Removal Act to be established unto the Dakotas that participated in any way into the war. Indians were sent to Davenport, Iowa for prison, hundreds of Indians, and thousands, or 1,000 or so around there, were sent to the Santee, Nebraska reservation. Now, there were a lot of Dakota Indians that fled to Canada, South Dakota, North Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin, even before imprisonment happened or exiles happened. Teote Duta and Chief Standing Buffalo and Shakopee, they fled. They almost made it to Canada. When they got to Canada, British soldiers noticed them, sent them right back to, and Medicine Bottle was one of those Indians. Medicine Bottle and Shakopee were sent to Fort Snelling for their hanging, for their punishment of war. And Teote Duta was shot by a settler while picking squash or corn or something like that. And Standing Buffalo, I believe, he did make it to Canada and got away with any crime of being charged against him for war treason or whatever. So 1886 comes around. U.S. Indian agent Robert B. Henton. 1886, there was 2 census rolls made. Robert B. Henton was making a list of friendly Sioux that could come back to Minnesota. See, the Dakota Removal Act banned Dakota Indians from 1863 to 2009. Okay, Dakota Indians were not allowed in Minnesota. In fact, 3 Dakota Indians together was considered a war party, and it was legal to shoot onto these warriors. And see, when they were even being brought to prison and into Nebraska, on the way, there was rocks thrown at them by settlers, and to the women and children who were sent off to Fort Snelling camp, they were getting rocks thrown at them. So 20 years or so goes by, Robert B. Henton, like I was saying, made these census rolls. The one particularly used in lawsuits and brought up quite often was the May 20th of 1886 Minnesota Mdewakanton suit. Minnesota Mdewakanton Sioux is an incorrect title for the census roll. Why? For the fact that other bands of Dakotas were listed on the census roll. Anywhere from Sisseton, Yankton, Menominee, Winnebago. Mdewakanton is not a term for Dakota Indians. That is a different band of Dakota Indians. You know, one of the 7 fire council flies. So anyway, 1886, these Indians, you know, they had mercy. I don't know if that was the decision of the president or the governor of Minnesota, but the Indians were being able to come back. And you can see in 1909 and 1913, either between those years, the Pipestone Agency schools were being established. But to get back to 1886, these lists were made. Then the Appropriation Acts were established, 1888, 1889, and 1890, for Minnesota Mdewakanton to be able to receive Indian land certificates. I believe there was 1,000 acres purchased under these 3 acts for the Minnesota Mdewakanton Sioux. Lineal descendants were able to go to Loyal Sioux Agency to be able to be verified and given the recommendation of Loyal Sioux's council. So Pipestone, when they were issuing the Indian land certificate, Loyal Sioux made sure that they were on census rolls. But then, so you got to go back and look, though. The IRA Act, the Indian Reorganization Act, happened in 1934. So there was Indian allotments being issued before this, but U.S. of Indian Affairs agents were coming to Prairie Island, Loyal Sioux, saying, this is how bylaws work, this is how a constitution works, this is how governance of your people work. Okay, you got people coming back to Minnesota. Okay, the war, you know, it's, yeah, 2009 they were supposed to be banned, but look, it's 1934, the Great Depression's going on, banks and businesses around America are filing bankruptcy, so we're giving them the New Deal, which will also consider you the New Deal for your Indian reorganization, just like how businesses reorganized. They considered a nationality of people. They gave them the chance to reorganize themselves, because Indians on their allotments of land were not assimilating to white society. Now, they were farming it, but as of building an American westernized society, there was none of that. So the government felt as, let's help these people learn how to govern their people. 1925 is when Native Americans were considered U.S. citizens. But the Loyal Mdewakanton, to jump back to that, see, you would have been loyal in 1862, not until 1886. If you never left Minnesota, if you're on the 1886 census roll, all that proves is that your ancestor was friendly Sioux, which that meant that you can come to Minnesota on the exceptions of your friendliness. That's why you see some Mdewakantons that are on the 1899 James McLaughlin roll. They're on that roll, but they're not on the Henton rolls. We'll get to that in a second. So these allotments of land, these were the old styles of ways of getting land under trust. So 1934, Loyal Sioux Indian community got federally recognized. Then 2 years later, 1936, Prairie Island Indian community got federally recognized based on these 1886 Indian allotments of land. Now that we know the difference between a friendly Sioux and a loyal Sioux, the Loyal Mdewakanton, the friendly Sioux, these are different Indians now. There's a lot of confusion saying that the 1886 list, those are the Loyal Mdewakanton. That is incorrect. That was even proven in Lettle's court in 2012. The list that is more accurate was in 1899 when James McLaughlin C. Robert B. Hinton died. They hired U.S. Indian agent James McLaughlin saying, hey, could you clean up the list and edit the list that Robert B. Hinton made? Because Dakota stories elders say that Robert B. Hinton was being paid off by Sisseton and Wahpeton Indians, saying, put me on the census roll so I can be on the Mdewakanton census roll so I can get anything. The Mdewakanton get treated the best. They got the best. They signed for the most treaties. You know, Yanktons, they didn't sign any treaties. So you got Robert B. Hinton getting paid off, putting these wrong Indians on the census roll. James McLaughlin edited the roll. That's why you see in 1899, a lot of these Indians on the 1886 aren't on that roll. So then 1917 comes around. You know, the Pipestone agency schools were already there 10 years before 1917. The Pipestone agency schools, kids, Indian kids from South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, and even Minnesota, they were going to these Pipestone agency Indian schools. Okay? At the time, the Bureau for Indian Affairs in Minnesota was in Pipestone. Pipestone schools were trying to teach Dakota Indians not to speak their language, learn the English language in the westernized society ways. So you got a whole bunch of Indians that are not loyal Mdewakanton coming into Minnesota based on the 1886 census roll. On May 20th, if you're in Minnesota on this date, you're on this roll. And you got Indians coming in from the Pipestone as time goes on. Their kids are coming back. Families are coming back from out of state back to home to Minnesota. So then you got 1934, the Indian Reorganization that considers Indians IRA Indians. So this gets to the three classes of Indians that I said in the beginning of the video. What's the difference? Well, if you're federally recognized, there are 567 tribes federally recognized in the United States under the 1934 Act. If you read according and thoroughly as the legal language states, the only sovereignty in this act is tribes can have possession of eagle feathers and practice cultural practices. This did not make Native Americans truly sovereign. After the 1934 Act was established, 1,600 acres was purchased for Lower Sioux and Prairie Island. Okay, they already had 1,000 acres out there from the Appropriation Act, so this is about 2,600 acres of land that are in today, present day, Lower Sioux, Morton, Prairie Island, Welch, Minnesota, and Shakopee, Mdewakanton, Sioux community, Shakopee. About 258 acres in Shakopee. All after this 1934 reorganization of these tribes. So then you got, Indians from the Pipestone School enrolling with Upper Sioux and Lower Sioux. Okay, making their way eventually to, Prairie Island. It wasn't until 1944 when my second great-grandfather, John Cermak, went to Lower Sioux, stand before council, was considered a bona fide Sioux Indian. Then Pipestone Agency issued an Indian land certificate unto him, resulting in 50 acres in Scott County, Minnesota. His son did the same thing. Milo, great-grandpa Milo Cermak, went to Pipestone Agency, okay, and got 79 acres. Moving off of that land, see, John Cermak lived on his land from 1944 into 1989. When he died, his son Edward lived on it until 1991, I believe. 1991. He died in 1992. John Cermak never left his land. He farmed it. Cattle on it. Chickens were on it. Many cars. He was, he owned a salvage yard, junkyard parts. So these were the, there was Indians living on Indian land in Shakopee before him. Like, I think of maybe the LeClaire family or the Felix family, or the Bluestone family, John Bluestone. They were living on Shakopee allotments of land. But in 1944 is when John Cermak got his Indian land certificate. That certificate is red seal, but it's still considered 1886 friendly lands. Okay, the loyal Mdewakanton never got acknowledged or any benefit given unto them other than that you could stay in Minnesota. Okay, we got a lot of Indians out here now trying to claim Indian ancestry now. What's the problem with this? Well, Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community, as after Prairie Island and Lower Sioux, lineal descendants from those tribes moved out to Shakopee. Grandpa John was leasing them land. They were getting land issued to them as well. Brewer family, I believe, came in there in the 50s, 1955 or maybe even 58, one of those 2 years. But anyway, families, the Crooks, Rosses, families were moving to Shakopee. 1969, they got federally acknowledged. Not federally acknowledged, federally recognized as an Indian tribe community. But then 1972 rolls around, and the Indian Claims Commission opens up in 1967, where it says, attention, attention, lineal descendants that are not enrolled into IRA tribes known as Shakopee, Prairie Island, or Lower Sioux, Mdewakanton, Wapakude lineal descendants who are not enrolled into these tribes, come onto this list that was gathered and compiled together by the Secretary of Interior in 1972 is when it was published. These are the lineal descendants. They had to prove back to original treaty signers. But like I was saying earlier in the video, James McLaughlin made that list in 1917. That was established in 1922. And then in 1925, there was only $129 issued to these people that were on this list, that the list only contained of 256 people. So then 1972, see, that was a Lower Mississippi Sioux Fund payout in 1925. So then in 1972, they went ahead and said, look, we're going to pay out dockets 359 through 363. This was a big deal. Why? Because this was the treaty money from the 1805 to 1858 treaty signings. These monies have never been paid other than in 1925. 1972, the list was made. 1981 is when just the interest payment was made out of docket 363. None of the tribes enrolled these lineal descendants made on this list. About a list of 3,700 people on this 1972 list. Tribes never enrolled them for distribution of judgment funds, where these three communities would get 20% of the Lower Mississippi Sioux Fund, and the 80% would go to the lineal descendants in per capita payments. This never happened. Then 2017 comes around. Another interest payment made out of docket 363. The other dockets have not been touched until now by us lineal descendants. But what's going on here? These people who are enrolled with Prairie Island, Lower Sioux, and Shakopee Mdewakanton, they're invalid for these docket shares. This is why you see Dakota leaders in 1967, Sisseton leader Albert Prescott and other people from Lower Sioux and Upper Sioux, they were trying to claim behalf for the Mdewakanton people for their Indian Claims Commission. But they said no. The Bureau said no. You cannot represent behalf for their treaty signings. There was nobody to represent the Lower Mississippi Sioux Indians in 1967. Therefore, the money stayed in an account until something of that happened, as in federal acknowledgement, which has happened. But this is a narrative of the difference between the IRA Indians, the loyal Indians, and the friendly Indians. Because, see, the IRA Indians, they never could get a per capita share of these dockets. Tribal leaders tried to get this money. Wolfchild, Prescott, Stanley, Crooks, Other Prairie Island, they even made a census roll trying to get this money. Once you enrolled, see, this is for all federal recognized tribes. Once you're enrolled, have an ID number with that community you're enrolled with, the treaty money is invalid to you, and the treaty rights are invalid to you because you're not sovereign or you're not established for money because of the treaties. You're established because of the 1934 Act. Tribes, 1934 Act, also known as corporate charters, they can be sued. It's a corporation as well. Business entities, casinos, other revenue sources as well. But the name of the game is to live on titles of Indian lands of your ancestors. 1886 lands, communities were able to, after the deaths of people of those Alati Indians, those lands went back to the communities. The 1980 Act was very vague. It does still say in there that Alati Indians are not affected by the 1980 Act. That was for more land to be acquired by tribes to be put into a trust under the Hearth Act, which is only a lease. That would be up in 75 years. But allotments of land are the foundation of the three communities today. Sioux land scripts, a lot of half-breed and mixed bloods don't live on them to this day. I know my family, cousin Ray Moran still has the land in the family since 1861 to present day. This is the Mon Night, as in the man, chase the dream.